On the morning of February 1st, 2012, police were dispatched to a home on Mulholland Drive after reports of a possible suicide. Inside, they found Don Cornelius, the visionary who had put James Brown, Aretha Franklin, Michael Jackson, and Stevie Wonder on national television every Saturday morning for 35 years. He had built the longest-running syndicated music program in American television history with just $400 and a borrowed camera. But by the time his life came to an end, the empire he had spent decades creating was already gone. He had sold it years earlier. His sons inherited the Cornelius name, but not the company. Today, the Soul Train empire belongs to people who never knew the man who built it. So what exactly went wrong? This is the tragic story Soul Train never told about itself. Chapter 1: Bronzeville, the Marines, and the Man with $400. Donald Cortez. Cornelius was born on September 27, 1936, in the Bronzeville neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, into a family of working people who built what they had in a city that had its own kind of segregation. Not the legal kind of the Deep South, but the kind written into hiring practices and invisible walls. He drew cartoons for the school newspaper at DuSable High School, graduated in 1954, and went straight into the Marines, serving 18 months in Korea before coming home and marrying his childhood sweetheart, Dolores Harrison, in 1956. By the mid-1960s, he had 2 young sons, a wife to support, and a list of jobs that had never felt right. Insurance, tires, automobiles, a brief stint as a Chicago police officer. None of it was the thing he was built for, and he knew it. So in 1966, with only $400 in his bank account and a family depending on him, he paid for a 3-month broadcasting course and walked away from the steady work entirely. That decision, $400, 2 young sons at home, and a deep conviction that something was wrong with what he saw on television, was the beginning of everything. He got a part-time job at WVON Radio in Chicago, then joined WCIU-TV in 1967 as host of a program called A Black's View of the News. And from inside that television station, he saw a gap so obvious he could not understand why nobody had moved on it. Black music was everywhere. Black teenagers were dancing to it in living rooms and community centers all across the city. Dick Clark's American Bandstand showed teenagers on television every week, and almost none of them were black, even though the music driving the entire youth culture of the country was being made by black artists. Don Cornelius saw that gap and decided he was going to be the one who closed it. Chapter 2: $400, 1 pilot, and the show. Nobody expected to work. Cornelius went to the management of WCIU with a proposal. He wanted to produce a soul music and dance program for the station, something styled after American Bandstand but built entirely around black artists and black dancers. The station managers listened. They were interested in reaching black audiences. But they had no money to put into the idea. So instead of writing a check, they did something that would turn out to be one of the most significant accidental gifts in the history of American television. They handed him the show outright and told him to produce it himself. They thought it was going to fail. That is the only way to explain giving a local television host full ownership of a program they were allowing him to use their airwaves to broadcast. But Cornelius took the ownership and ran with it. He produced a pilot with his own money, went out and found a sponsor in Sears, Roebuck & Company, and on August 17, 1970, Soul Train premiered on WCIU in Chicago as a daily live program. Don Cornelius hosted it, produced it, and sold all the advertising himself. Within weeks, Soul Train was the #1 show among black viewers in Chicago. The concept was simple, but it had never been done before: a television stage where black artists performed their actual music and black teenagers danced to it. Not as background, not as guests on someone else's show, as the center of everything. The stage, the camera, the host, all of it built around celebrating black culture as something worth being the main event. Cornelius knew immediately that Chicago was only the beginning. If this worked here, it would work in every city in America where black communities had been starved of the same thing. He began planning a national version. He needed a sponsor willing to commit to a nationally syndicated show, and he found one in George Johnson, the founder of Johnson Products, a black-owned company that made the Afro Sheen hair care line. Johnson understood exactly what Cornelius was building and why it needed to exist. The partnership locked in. Soul Train made its national debut on October 2, 1971, in 8 markets. The syndicating agency had only managed to place it in 8 of the 25 cities Cornelius had targeted. Most of the stations that passed on it had no black-oriented programming at all and still decided they did not want it. Within 8 months, all 25 markets were carrying the show. Cornelius had been right, and every station that turned him down had to come back and ask to be added. The show moved to Los Angeles to tape at Hollywood's Metro Media Studios. It ran once a week, glitzier and more colorful than the Chicago version had been, but built on the same idea. Black artists on a stage, black dancers in the audience. A host whose voice and presence told everyone watching that this was something to take seriously. James Brown performed, Gladys Knight performed, Marvin Gaye performed, the Jackson 5 performed, with a teenage Michael Jackson dancing and singing in a way that nobody watching had ever seen before. Don Cornelius had built something that Black America had been waiting for without knowing there was a name for what it was waiting for. Every Saturday morning, millions of people sat in front of their television sets and saw themselves reflected back in a way that the rest of the television schedule had never offered. Chapter 3: The Empire Behind the Show. Soul Train was not just a television program. That is the thing that most people outside the business world do not fully understand when they look back at what Cornelius built. The show was the face of something much larger. It was the anchor of an enterprise that Don Cornelius spent 3 decades constructing around it, piece by piece, in the same way he had originally constructed the show itself, without a partner, without outside money, and without asking anyone's permission. By 1974, 95 television stations were carrying Soul Train. Cornelius had negotiated something extraordinarily rare for a black producer in the early 1970s. He owned the show. Not the station, not the network, the creator, the content, the archive, every frame of every performance. At a time when the television industry routinely stripped black creators of the rights to their own work, Cornelius had held on to his because the station that first let him use their airtime had done so by giving him the show rather than buying it from him. In 1975, he expanded the brand by launching Soul Train Records, a label that signed artists and released music connected to the show's audience. In 1987, he launched the Soul Train Music Awards, an annual ceremony celebrating the best of black music in categories the mainstream award shows routinely overlooked. Over the years, the awards ceremony added the Soul Train Lady of Soul Awards and the Soul Train Christmas Starfest, creating an annual calendar of events that kept the Soul Train brand relevant and generating revenue well beyond the Saturday morning time slot. He also built the audience for the show into an asset of its own. The Soul Train dancers, the young people who auditioned by the thousands to be part of the studio audience, became tastemakers in fashion, style, and dance. What people wore on Soul Train showed up in high schools and on street corners the following Monday. The dances they performed created movements that spread across the country. Don Cornelius had not just created a television show. He had created the most powerful weekly showcase of black popular culture in American history, and he owned every piece of it. Spike Lee called Soul Train an urban music time capsule. Quincy Jones said that before MTV there was Soul Train, and that its contributions to television, music, and culture would never be matched. At its peak, the show was reaching 30 million viewers a week. Every major black artist in America had to come through that studio if they wanted to reach the audience that mattered most to them. Don Cornelius had built the empire from $400 and a 3-month broadcasting course. He owned it alone. His sons, Anthony and Raymond, grew up watching him build it, knowing that one day it was supposed to be theirs to carry forward. Chapter 4: The Brain Surgery That Changed Everything. In 1982, at the height of Soul Train's power and cultural influence, Don Cornelius underwent brain surgery. The operation lasted 21 hours. It was performed to correct a congenital malformation in the blood vessels of his brain, a defect he had been living with since birth without knowing it. He survived the surgery. But the man who came out of that operating room was not the same man who went in. and Cornelius admitted as much in interviews afterward. He told the Washington Post that you are never quite the same after a surgery like that. He said that travel, which was a constant part of running a nationally syndicated television production, had become a serious physical test afterward. The seizures started. Not immediately and not dramatically, but over time, complications from the surgery began producing neurological symptoms that accumulated slowly over the years that followed. He hosted Soul Train for 11 more years after that surgery, continuing through 1993 before stepping back from the host chair. He remained the executive producer. He stayed in control of the brand. But the daily physical demands of being the on-screen presence of the show had become too much to sustain indefinitely alongside the health challenges he was managing privately. Celebrity hosts took over the front of the stage while Cornelius continued running the company behind it. His son Tony joined the business and worked with his father for more than 15 years, involved in various aspects of the Soul Train franchise. The show had been a family enterprise in everything but formal structure, and there had always been an understanding between Don and his sons that what he had built was something that would outlast him and belong to the next generation. Soul Train was not supposed to end with Don Cornelius. It was supposed to outlive him the way many family empires outlived their founders. But what was happening to his health in private was more serious than almost anyone around him fully understood. And the decisions he would make about the future of the company as his body began to fail him would change everything his sons had expected to inherit. Chapter 5. The Sale That Left the Family with Nothing to Hold. By the mid-2000s, Soul Train was in trouble. The show had ended its original run in 2006, 35 years after it went national, because the ratings had been dropping for years. The landscape that Cornelius had created the show to fill no longer had the same shape. MTV had existed for 25 years and had gradually absorbed the function that Soul Train had invented. BT was providing a home for black music on television. The internet was changing where young people went to discover music entirely. The syndication deal that had been the backbone of the show's distribution fell apart when Tribune Entertainment, which had been handling the show's syndication since 1985, announced it was closing at the end of 2007. Without a distribution partner and with his health declining seriously, Cornelius faced a decision about the future of the franchise that he would have to make at a time when he was least equipped to think clearly about it. In May 2008, Don Cornelius sold the Soul Train franchise to Mad Vision Entertainment, a company backed by the private equity firm Intermedia Partners. The sale included the brand name, the broadcast library with over 1,100 hours of archival footage, and the production rights to the show. The exact terms were never fully disclosed publicly. What was disclosed was that Cornelius retained a small interest. His sons retained nothing. The franchise he had built from the ground up, that had run for 35 years, that had featured every major black artist of the era, was now owned by investors. Mad Vision's plans to revive Soul Train on new platforms never materialized into new episodes. 3 years later, in 2011, Mad Vision sold the rights to a consortium led by Magic Johnson and backed by Intermedia Partners. The Johnson Group had plans for a film, a Broadway show, and a Soul Train cruise. Some of those ideas moved forward in limited form. The Soul Train Music Awards were eventually revived through BET, but the show itself, the weekly Saturday morning experience that had been the center of everything, never came back. In August 2025, BET suspended the Soul Train Music Awards indefinitely, citing a need to reconfigure for digital priorities. The award ceremony that Cornelius had created in 1987 to extend his brand, which had run for decades as one of the most important annual events in black music, was quietly shelved. The Cornelius family had no role in that decision. They had had no role in any decision about the brand since 2008. Don Cornelius had spent 38 years building an empire that other people could not have imagined before he built it. He sold it in 2008. His sons watched from outside. Chapter 6. The Final Years and the Morning on Mulholland Drive. The years between 2008 and 2012 were the hardest of Don Cornelius's life. He had sold the franchise. His second marriage, to a Russian model named Victoria Chapman, whom he had married in 2001, had collapsed in a legal battle that was ugly by any measure. In October 2008, the same month the sale of Soul Train was closing, he was arrested on a felony domestic violence charge and spent time in court facing allegations that eventually resolved with a no-contest plea and 3 years of probation. His health continued to deteriorate. He had suffered a stroke. Friends and associates who spent time with him in his final years described a man who had become slower and more inward, still sharp in conversation but moving through the world with difficulty. He told people he had never been quite the same since the brain surgery in 1982, and in the last 6 months of his life the decline became much more pronounced. Former Soul Train host Shamar Moore suggested in interviews after his death that Cornelius may have been in the early stages of dementia or Alzheimer's by the end. On the night of January 31, 2012, he called his son Tony. Tony Cornelius described the call as one of urgency. He came to his father's home immediately. He found his father in a state of distress that he had never seen before, a man who had always been, in his words, extremely private and who kept everything inside. Don told his son during that call, in words Tony would later repeat in interviews, "I don't know how much longer I can take this." At approximately 4 in the morning on February 1, 2012, police were called to the house on Mulholland Drive. Don Cornelius was found with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He was taken to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center and pronounced dead at 4:57 in the morning. He was 75 years old. An autopsy confirmed that he had been suffering from seizures for at least the last 15 years of his life, a direct complication of the brain surgery he had undergone in 1982. Tony Cornelius spoke to the press within days of his father's death. He described a man who had been unhappy about his health, about the divorce, about the relationships in his life that had broken down. He said his father was very private, that he kept things inside, and that even as someone who had been close to him for years, he could not fully explain what had happened that morning. He said the more he thought about it, the more he chose to see it as a celebration of everything his father had built, rather than the way it ended. Aretha Franklin, who had performed on Soul Train, called his death sad, stunning, and downright shocking. She said he had single-handedly brought about a unity among young adults worldwide with the unforgettable creation of Soul Train. Quincy Jones said his contributions to television, music, and culture as a whole would never be matched. Chapter 7. What the Family Carries Now. The Soul Train story does not end with the family still in possession of the company the founder built, still running the show, still carrying the name on the masthead. Don Cornelius sold the franchise 4 years before he died, and the family he left behind inherited a legacy without the business underneath it. His sons carry the name and the memory. Someone else owns the archive. Tony Cornelius has spent the years since his father's death doing what he can with what remains. He served as one of the executive producers on American Soul, a BET drama series that aired beginning in 2019 and dramatized the creation of Soul Train and the pressures Don Cornelius faced during the 1970s building the show in Hollywood. The series portrayed his father's vision and his struggle with a television industry that had never seen anything like what he was trying to create, and it introduced a new generation to a program they had not grown up watching. Tony also launched the Don Cornelius Foundation, a nonprofit organization focused on suicide awareness and prevention. A conversation with Stevie Wonder in the days after his father's death gave him the conviction to turn the tragedy into something that could help other people. The foundation works to identify programs that support those who are struggling and those who have lost people they love to suicide. It is one of the few direct continuations of the Cornelius name into active public work. In November 2023, Don Cornelius was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with the Ahmet Ertegun Award, recognizing his contributions as a creator and producer who changed what American television was willing to show and what Black culture was allowed to be in front of a national audience. It was an acknowledgement, arriving more than a decade after his death, that what he had built mattered at a level that the industry had not always been willing to admit while he was alive. The show itself has not come back. The 1,100 hours of archival footage that Cornelius spent 35 years accumulating, every performance by every artist who stood on that stage from 1970 to 2006, sits in a library owned by outside investors. Magic Johnson's consortium has discussed films and stage productions. The Soul Train Music Awards returned, ran for years through BET, and were then suspended in 2025. The brand moves through different hands and different agendas, while the family that originated it watches from the outside. Don Cornelius built Soul Train from $400, a pilot he funded himself, and a conviction that black culture deserved its own national stage. He held on to ownership of it at a time when the television industry routinely stripped black creators of everything. He ran it for 35 years. He brought James Brown, Aretha Franklin, Michael Jackson, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, Prince, Whitney Houston, and every other significant black artist of those decades to a Saturday morning audience that counted on him to show up every week. He built something irreplaceable and then sold it when his health would not allow him to hold on to it anymore. His sons have the legacy and the foundation and the memory. But the empire itself belongs to someone else. That is the Soul Train story the show never told about itself. Now, let us hear from you in the comments. Do you think Don Cornelius should have found a way to keep Soul Train inside the family before selling in 2008? Or was his health at that point leaving him no real choice? We would love to know what you think. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more. See you in the next video.